The chandeliers were still swaying from the last round of applause when Amelia Grant stood on the marble staircase and made a promise she never meant to keep. 200 guests filled the ballroom of her father's estate that night, every one of them dressed in silk and diamonds, every one of them watching her the way people watch a queen they secretly hope will stumble. Amelia was used to that kind of attention. She had grown up under it, raised in a house where every smile was rehearsed and every dance partner was chosen for the size of his family's fortune, not the size of his heart. Her father, Edward Grant, stood near the fireplace with a glass of dark wine in his hand, watching her with the sharp, calculating eyes of a man who had built an empire out of shipping routes and never once stopped counting his advantages. Beside him stood Charles Whitman, the son of his business partner, a tall young man with a practiced smile and cold, careful eyes. Everyone in the room already knew why Charles had been invited. An announcement was expected before midnight, a merger disguised as a marriage. Amelia knew it too. She had known it for weeks, ever since her father sat her down in his study and told her, in the calm voice he used for business decisions, that her engagement to Charles would secure the future of the family shipping company. He had not asked her. He had informed her. She had smiled and said nothing, because saying nothing was the only kind of rebellion she was ever allowed. But that night, standing on the staircase with every eye in the room fixed on her, something inside her refused to stay quiet any longer. It started as a joke. A group of young men, encouraged by too much champagne, had gathered near the old grand piano that stood untouched in the corner of the ballroom. It had belonged to her mother, who died when Amelia was young, and no one in the house had touched it in years. Her father kept it polished and tuned out of habit, or perhaps guilt, but its keys had gone silent long ago. One of the young men, a friend of Charles named Peter, banged out a clumsy off-key tune and turned to Amelia with a grin. "Since you seem impossible to impress, Miss Grant, perhaps a challenge is in order. Whoever can play something on that piano worth hearing, you should marry him instead." The room laughed. It was meant as nothing more than a party joke, the kind of thing said and forgotten by morning. But something in Amelia, some tired, reckless part of her that was sick of being told who to marry and how to feel, decided to answer it seriously. She lifted her chin, looked at the crowd, and said the words that would follow her for the rest of her life. "Play something that moves me," she said, her voice carrying clear across the ballroom, "and I will marry you instead." She said it with a laugh, the kind of laugh that dares the world to prove her wrong. She said it because she believed, with complete certainty, that no one in that room could do it. Charles could not play a single note. Peter's own attempt had been embarrassing. The other young men were bankers and shipping heirs, not musicians. It was a safe joke, a harmless little rebellion against a night that had already been decided for her. One by one, the young men in the room took their turn at the piano, laughing, fumbling through half-remembered lessons from childhood, banging out songs that made the crowd groan and clap sarcastically. Amelia watched with her arms crossed, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. This was fun. This was the only fun she'd had in weeks. Her father did not find it fun at all. Edward Grant's jaw tightened with every failed attempt, his eyes flicking toward Charles, silently urging him to step forward and end this foolish game before it embarrassed the family. But Charles only shook his head and laughed along with the others, too proud to risk making a fool of himself in front of his future business partners. It was near the edge of the room, half hidden behind a pillar, where Samuel Hart had been quietly working all evening. He was the building's janitor, a tall man in his 50s with gray threading through his dark hair and deep lines etched into a face that had clearly seen more hardship than comfort. He wore the same plain gray uniform he always wore, moving unnoticed through the grand rooms of the estate, straightening chairs, refilling candles, keeping his eyes low the way people expect service workers to do at parties like this. Nobody in that ballroom had ever asked his name. Nobody had ever needed to. He had been setting a stack of folded linens near the wall when the challenge was made, and he had almost let it pass without a second thought. He had learned, over many long years, the value of staying invisible. But something about the piano pulled at him. Maybe it was the shape of it, the same elegant curve he remembered from another life. Maybe it was simply that his hands, resting quietly at his sides for so long, suddenly ached with a memory they had not felt in years. He set down the linens. The laughter in the room slowly died as people noticed him walking toward the piano. A janitor, crossing the ballroom floor in his gray uniform, past silk gowns and polished shoes, past the disbelieving stares of guests who could not understand what he thought he was doing. Someone snickered. Someone else murmured something about the staff overstepping their place. Charles rolled his eyes and turned to whisper something to Peter, both of them smirking, already certain of the embarrassment about to unfold. Amelia felt her cheeks flush, not from anger, but from a strange, sudden discomfort she could not name. She almost wanted to stop him, to tell him this game was not meant for him, that it would be cruel to let him make a fool of himself in front of people who already looked down on him. But before she could speak, Samuel had already reached the piano bench. He paused there for a moment, his hand resting on the smooth, dark wood of the instrument, the way a man might rest his hand on the shoulder of an old friend he had not seen in years. His eyes closed briefly. Then he sat down. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the kind filled with quiet snickers and exchanged glances, everyone waiting for the punchline of what they assumed would be a clumsy, awkward performance. His fingers touched the keys. At first there was nothing but a single low note, deep and resonant, hanging in the air like a held breath. Then another note joined it, and another, and slowly, impossibly, a melody began to rise from beneath his hands. It was not the fumbling, half-remembered tune of a hobbyist. It was something else entirely, something trained, something that had been carried inside him for years, waiting for a chance to breathe again. The laughter in the room died instantly. Amelia felt her breath catch in her throat. The melody was slow and aching, filled with a kind of sorrow she had never heard expressed through music before, not sorrow that begged for pity, but sorrow that had been carefully shaped into something beautiful, something that spoke of loss and endurance in equal measure. His fingers moved across the keys with a precision and grace that seemed impossible for a man in a janitor's uniform. His shoulders relaxed, his eyes closed, completely lost in the music the way a person is lost in a memory they cannot let go of. The guests who had been laughing moments before now stood frozen, champagne glasses forgotten in their hands. Even the servers along the walls had stopped moving. The only sound in that enormous ballroom was the piano, filling every corner of the room with something raw and honest, in a way that none of the polished conversations of the evening had ever managed to be. Amelia found herself walking closer without realizing she had moved at all. She stopped a few feet from the piano, staring at this man she had passed 100 times without truly seeing, watching his hands move like they belonged to someone entirely different from the quiet, invisible figure who swept the halls each morning. The melody rose gently before falling into something quieter, something achingly tender, and for a brief, strange moment, Amelia felt as though the music was not just being played for the room, it was being played for her. It felt like he understood something about being trapped, about smiling through expectations that were never truly your own, about carrying weight nobody else could see. Tears welled in her eyes before she even realized it, and when she glanced around the room, she was not alone. Several of the older guests, the ones who perhaps remembered concert halls from another era, stood with their hands pressed to their chests. Even her father, standing rigid near the fireplace, had gone very still, his wine glass forgotten in his hand, his sharp eyes fixed on the janitor with an expression Amelia had never seen on his face before. Something between recognition and disbelief. The final notes came slow and soft, fading into silence the way a candle gently burns down to nothing. When Samuel lifted his hands from the keys, the room remained silent for a long moment, as if no one quite trusted themselves to break whatever spell had just been cast. Then, from somewhere near the back, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another. Within moments, the entire ballroom had erupted into applause, uncertain and stunned at first, then growing louder and more genuine with every passing second. Samuel did not stand to take a bow. He simply sat there for a moment, his head bowed slightly, his hands resting quietly in his lap, as though the applause belonged to someone else entirely, someone he used to be a long time ago. Amelia stood frozen at the center of it all, her heart pounding in her chest, her earlier joke suddenly feeling less like a joke and more like a promise she had accidentally made to the wrong person, or perhaps, she realized with a strange, sinking feeling, exactly the right one. Charles stepped forward first, his face tight with poorly hidden irritation. "A nice party trick," he said loudly, forcing a laugh that no one else joined. "I'm sure the staff appreciates a moment in the spotlight." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but they did not carry the same conviction as before. The mood in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it, even if no one wanted to admit it out loud. Amelia turned to look at Samuel, who had risen from the bench, and was already reaching for the stack of linens he had abandoned, preparing to slip back into invisibility, the way he always did. But it was too late for that now. She had seen him, really seen him, for the first time. "Wait," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, but firm enough to stop him where he stood. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Her father's voice cut through the silence, before Samuel could respond. Amelia. Just her name, sharp and warning, the way he said it when he wanted her to remember exactly where she stood and exactly what was expected of her. She looked at her father, then at Charles, whose jaw was clenched so tightly it looked painful, then finally back at Samuel, who stood very still, his eyes lowered, waiting to see what she would do next. The challenge had been a joke. Everyone in that ballroom knew it had been a joke, including Amelia herself, right up until the moment those first notes filled the room and something inside her chest had quietly, irreversibly shifted. She was not foolish enough to announce anything that night, not with her father's eyes burning into her, not with Charles standing there humiliated in front of people whose approval mattered to the family business. But as the party resumed around her, the music replaced by the low hum of nervous conversation, Amelia found herself unable to stop glancing toward the corner of the room, toward the quiet man in the gray uniform who had somehow, in the space of a single song, made her feel more understood than anyone in her privileged, carefully arranged life ever had. Later that night, long after most of the guests had gone home and the great house had grown quiet, Amelia slipped out of her bedroom and made her way down to the ballroom, drawn back to the piano the way one is drawn back to the scene of something unforgettable. The room was dark except for the moonlight spilling through the tall windows, catching the polished surface of the piano and turning it silver. Samuel was still there, gathering the last of the used glasses and folded tablecloths, moving quietly through the emptied space. He froze when he saw her standing in the doorway, clearly not expecting anyone, least of all her. "Miss Grant," he said, straightening quickly, his voice careful and formal, the voice of a man who understood exactly how easily his position could be taken from him. "I apologize if I overstepped earlier. I did not mean to embarrass anyone." "You didn't embarrass anyone," Amelia said, stepping further into the room. "You did the opposite." He said nothing, watching her with a kind of cautious uncertainty, the same way a person watches a door they are not sure is safe to walk through. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, her voice softer now, stripped of the performance she usually wore in front of others. That wasn't the piano of someone who just picked it up for fun. Samuel's eyes drifted toward the instrument, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, something heavy and complicated, that he clearly did not want to explain. "It was a long time ago," he said finally. "Another life, really. Will you tell me about it?" He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she was asking out of genuine curiosity, or simply the passing interest of a bored young woman looking for a new distraction. Whatever he saw in her expression seemed to satisfy him, at least enough to answer. "Not tonight," he said gently. "It's late, and you should rest. Parties like this one require energy I no longer have to spare." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet, practiced acceptance that made Amelia's chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. She wanted to press further, to demand answers the way she was used to demanding things in her life, but something about the exhaustion in his eyes stopped her. "Then I'll ask you tomorrow," she said instead, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Samuel offered her the smallest hint of a smile, the first genuine one she had seen from him all evening. "If you like, Miss Grant." "Amelia," she corrected softly. "Just Amelia." He nodded once, though he did not repeat her name aloud, and turned back to his work, leaving her standing alone in the moonlit ballroom, staring at the piano that had, in the span of a single evening, quietly turned her entire carefully planned life upside down. Upstairs, her father was already awake, standing at his study window with a glass of wine he had not touched, watching the darkened garden below. He had recognized something in that music tonight, a fear that had been buried for years, suddenly rising back to the surface. He had hoped, foolishly, that certain ghosts from his past would never find their way back into his house. He did not yet know how right and how wrong that hope would turn out to be. Morning came to the Grant estate with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Amelia woke earlier than usual, her mind still full of the melody from the night before, the notes replaying themselves over and over in her memory like a song she could not shake loose. She dressed quickly, skipped the formal breakfast her father insisted on every morning, and made her way down to the gardens where the household staff usually gathered before beginning their duties. She found Samuel near the small stone shed at the edge of the property, repairing a broken latch on the garden gate. He looked different in the daylight, less like a ghost from a forgotten world and more like an ordinary man doing ordinary work, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a light sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cool morning air. When he noticed her approaching, he set down his tools and straightened, offering a polite nod. "Good morning, Miss Grant. I told you last night, it's Amelia." A faint smile touched his lips, though his eyes remained cautious, the way a man's eyes stay cautious when he has learned, through hard experience, that kindness from people above his station rarely lasts. "Old habits," he said simply. She crossed her arms, studying him with the same curiosity she had felt watching his hands move across the piano keys. You said you'd tell me about it. Where you learned to play. Samuel glanced past her, toward the house, as though checking whether anyone was watching them from the windows. Satisfied that they were alone, he returned his attention to her, some of the guardedness in his posture easing, if only slightly. It was a long time ago, he said again, though this time he continued instead of stopping there. I trained at a conservatory in the city, starting when I was very young. My mother believed I had a gift, and she made sure I never wasted it. By the time I was 20, I was performing in concert halls across the country. There were years when I thought music was the only thing I would ever need in my life. What happened? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward some point in the distance that Amelia could not see, somewhere far beyond the garden walls. Life happened, he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made it clear there was far more to the story than he was willing to share so soon. Things fell apart. Music was the first thing I lost, but it was far from the only thing. Amelia wanted to press further, but something in his expression told her this was not a door that would open easily, and certainly not on the second morning of knowing him. She had learned enough about people, despite her sheltered upbringing, to recognize pain that had been buried deep enough to require careful handling. I'm sorry, she said instead, and she meant it. Samuel studied her for a moment, as if surprised by the sincerity in her voice. Most people in this house did not apologize to him for anything. Most people in this house did not speak to him at all beyond instructions and complaints. You don't need to apologize, Miss Grant. It was a long time ago. Amelia, she corrected again, more gently this time. This time he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. Amelia. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of hurried footsteps on the gravel path. Grace Turner, Amelia's closest friend since childhood, came rushing toward them with an expression of barely contained excitement, her dark curls bouncing with every step. There you are, Grace said breathlessly, stopping just short of them, and glancing curiously between Amelia and Samuel before quickly composing herself. Your father is asking for you. He seems unsettled this morning. Amelia felt a small knot form in her stomach. Her father rarely seemed unsettled about anything. He built his entire life around the appearance of control, and any crack in that composure usually meant something serious. I should go, she said, glancing back at Samuel. But I'm not finished with our conversation. I didn't imagine you would be, Samuel replied, and there was something almost fond in the way he said it, quickly hidden behind his usual careful reserve. As Amelia followed Grace back toward the house, her friend leaned in close, lowering her voice to a whisper. You spent the whole morning talking with the janitor? After what happened last night, do you have any idea how that looks? I don't care how it looks, Amelia said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Grace shot her a worried glance. Charles is furious, Amelia. He's been telling everyone that the whole thing was a staged trick, that the man must have been hired specifically to embarrass him. Your father hasn't said much, but I've never seen him look so pale. Amelia frowned, turning the words over in her mind. A staged trick. It was a ridiculous accusation, but she understood immediately why Charles would want to believe it. The alternative, that he had simply been outperformed and outclassed by a member of the household staff in front of everyone who mattered to his family's business reputation, was far more difficult for a man like him to accept. They found Edward Grant in his study, standing behind his large mahogany desk with his hands clasped tightly behind his back, staring out the window at the garden below. He turned when Amelia entered, and for a brief, unguarded moment, she saw something in his expression that unsettled her, far more than his usual sternness ever had. Fear. Close the door, he said quietly. Amelia did as he asked, exchanging a quick glance with Grace before her friend excused herself to wait outside. Once they were alone, her father gestured for her to sit, though he remained standing, pacing slowly in front of the tall windows. Last night, he began, choosing his words with obvious care, was an unfortunate embarrassment. I trust you understand the position it has put this family in, with the Whitmans. It wasn't an embarrassment, Amelia said carefully. It was the only honest moment of the entire evening. Her father's eyes flashed with something sharp and dangerous, though he quickly reined it back in. You made a foolish promise in front of 200 witnesses, Amelia. A promise that certain people are now taking far more seriously than either of us anticipated. It was a joke, she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she was no longer entirely certain that was true anymore. Charles does not see it that way. And more importantly, neither does the rest of society who was present. Word of what happened has already begun to spread through the city. Do you understand what that means for this family's reputation, and for the business arrangement I have spent years carefully building? Amelia felt a familiar frustration rising in her chest, the same suffocating feeling she had lived with for years. the sense of being nothing more than a piece on her father's business chessboard. So this is about the merger. It's always about the merger. It is about survival, her father snapped, his composure finally cracking. You have no understanding of the pressures this family faces, of the debts and obligations that keep this house standing. The arrangement with the Whitmans is not simply convenient, Amelia, it is necessary. Then perhaps you should have married Charles yourself, she said sharply, immediately regretting the bitterness in her own voice, though she did not take the words back. Her father's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all, simply staring at her with an expression she could not fully read. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said something that caught her completely off guard. That man, the one who played the piano last night. What is his name? Amelia blinked, thrown by the sudden shift in the conversation. Samuel Hart. Why does that matter? Something flickered across her father's face, gone as quickly as it appeared, but not quickly enough to escape Amelia's notice. Recognition. And beneath it, something that looked almost like guilt. No reason, he said, too quickly, turning back toward the window. I simply wish to know the names of everyone employed under my roof. Amelia did not believe him for a single second, but she recognized the finality in his tone, the same tone that always signaled the end of a conversation he had no intention of continuing. She left the study with more questions than she had walked in with, and the beginnings of a suspicion she could not yet fully explain. That suspicion only grew over the following days. Amelia found herself seeking out Samuel whenever she could manage it, slipping away from her usual obligations to help him in the gardens, or finding excuses to be near the ballroom while he worked, always steering their conversations gently back toward his past. He remained guarded, offering small fragments here and there, never the full picture, but each piece deepened the ache she felt on his behalf. She learned that he had once been considered one of the most promising young pianists in the country, that critics had written glowing reviews of his performances, that he had toured concert halls in cities she had only read about in books. She learned that he had been married once, to a woman named Clara, whose photograph he kept carefully folded inside his coat pocket, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. She learned that he had a daughter as well, though whenever her name came up, Samuel's expression would close off entirely, the pain behind it clearly too raw to discuss. What she could not learn, no matter how gently she asked, was exactly what had happened to bring his brilliant career to such an abrupt and devastating end. One afternoon, nearly a week after the party, Amelia found herself in the estate's private library, searching through old newspaper archives her father kept meticulously filed for business purposes. She was not entirely sure what she was looking for, only that her father's strange reaction to Samuel's name had planted a seed of curiosity she could not ignore. It took nearly 2 hours of searching before she found it, tucked into a folder of old financial records from over a decade earlier. A newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, featuring a photograph of a much younger Samuel Hart, standing beside a grand piano on a concert hall stage, his arm wrapped around a smiling woman Amelia recognized instantly from the worn photograph in his coat pocket, Clara. The headline above the photograph read of a rising young pianist whose promising career had come to a sudden halt following the collapse of a private investment fund that had financed his family's concert tours and management. Amelia's breath caught as her eyes scanned further down the article, landing on a name she recognized far too well. The investment fund had been managed, in part, by a young and ambitious businessman named Edward Grant. Amelia sat frozen in the quiet library, the newspaper clipping trembling slightly in her hands, the pieces of a puzzle she had not even realized she was assembling, suddenly clicking into place with terrible clarity. Her father was not simply unsettled by a stranger's impressive piano performance. He was unsettled because he recognized a man whose entire life he may have played a hand in destroying. She did not yet know the full truth of what had happened all those years ago, whether her father's involvement had been an act of deliberate cruelty or simply the careless consequence of business decisions made without concern for the people they affected. But she knew, with a certainty that settled heavy and cold in her chest, that the connection between her father and Samuel was no coincidence at all. And somewhere out in that garden, a man who had once filled concert halls with music, now spent his days trimming hedges and repairing gates, carrying a grief he had never been allowed to properly grieve, working quietly under the roof of the very family that may have taken everything from him in the first place. Amelia folded the newspaper clipping carefully and slipped it into her pocket, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. Whatever the truth turned out to be, she intended to uncover every last piece of it, no matter what it cost her, and no matter how much her father wished for the past to remain buried. Amelia did not sleep that night. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, the folded newspaper clipping resting on the nightstand beside her like a small, dangerous weight. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Samuel's hands moving across the piano keys, and beneath that image, the photograph of him standing beside his wife, young and hopeful, with no idea of the devastation waiting just beyond the edge of that happy moment. By the time morning arrived, Fee had made her decision. She would not go to her father first. She would go to Samuel. She found him in the small groundskeeper's cottage at the far edge of the estate, a modest stone building tucked behind a row of tall hedges, far enough from the main house that most guests never even knew it existed. She had never been inside before, had never had a reason to, but that morning she knocked on the weathered wooden door without hesitation. Samuel opened it a moment later, clearly surprised to find her standing there. "Amelia, is something wrong?" "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to be honest with me, no matter how difficult it might be to answer." Something in her tone must have told him this was not an ordinary conversation, because he stepped back and opened the door wider, allowing her inside without argument. The cottage was small but tidy, sparsely furnished, with a single bookshelf crowded with worn volumes and a small writing desk positioned near the window. On the wall above the desk hung a single framed photograph, the same one Amelia recognized from his coat pocket, of Samuel and Clara standing together outside a grand concert hall. She pulled the folded newspaper clipping from her pocket and held it out to him without a word. Samuel's expression shifted the moment he saw it, the color draining slightly from his face as recognition set in. He took it carefully, almost reverently, his eyes scanning the old headline and the photograph beneath it. For a long moment he said nothing at all, simply staring at the image of his younger self, a man he clearly no longer recognized in his own reflection. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "In my father's private files," Amelia said. "Samuel, is it true? Was my father involved in whatever happened to you?" Samuel lowered himself slowly into the chair beside the writing desk, the newspaper clipping still held gently in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual careful restraint. It was tired, and old, and full of a grief that had clearly been carried alone for far too long. "Your father was young then," he began, ambitious, eager to build a name for himself outside his own father's shadow. He managed an investment fund that many musicians relied on to finance their concert tours and management contracts. My own manager convinced me to place my earnings into that fund, promising it would multiply my savings and secure my family's future. He paused, his thumb tracing absently over the edge of the photograph. For a while, it worked exactly as promised. Clara and I were happier than I ever imagined possible. We had just welcomed our daughter Lily into the world. I was performing in the finest concert halls in the country, and for the first time in my life, I believed nothing could ever take that happiness away from me. "What happened?" Amelia asked softly, though she already feared she knew the shape of the answer. "The fund collapsed," Samuel said. "One of your father's business partners had been quietly siphoning money for years, hiding the losses behind falsified records. When the truth finally came out, everything fell apart almost overnight. Investors lost everything, myself included. My management contracts were tied directly to that fund, and when it collapsed, so did every opportunity I had built my entire life around." Amelia felt sick to her stomach, though she forced herself to keep listening, needing to understand the full weight of what her family had cost this man. "It wasn't only the money," Samuel continued, his voice growing quieter still. "Clara had always struggled with a weak heart, something the doctors had warned us about since before we married. The stress of losing everything, the fear of not being able to provide for Lily, it wore her down faster than any of us realized. She passed away less than a year later." The words settled over the small cottage like a heavy fog, and Amelia found herself blinking back sudden tears, though she knew this was not her grief to claim, only her family's debt to acknowledge. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Samuel shook his head slowly. "It was a long time ago. I've made my peace with most of it, as much as any man can. I gave up performing entirely after that. I couldn't bring myself to sit at a piano without thinking of everything music had cost me. I took whatever work I could find to keep Lily fed and clothed, and eventually, that work led me here." "Where is Lily now?" For the first time since Amelia had known him, Samuel's composed exterior cracked entirely. His eyes glistening with tears, he clearly fought hard to hold back. "She lives with her aunt, my late wife's sister, in a small town 2 hours from the city. I send whatever money I can each month, but I haven't seen her in person for nearly 3 years. It became too difficult, watching her grow up through brief visits, knowing I couldn't give her the life her mother and I had once dreamed of providing." Amelia sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of everything he had shared, feeling the shape of a man's entire shattered life settling into place before her. This was not simply an interesting story about a talented janitor. This was a man who had lost his career, his wife, and years of his daughter's childhood, all because of decisions made by people who had likely never once considered the human cost of their ambition. "My father should have to answer for this," she said finally, anger creeping into her voice. "Your father did nothing illegal," Samuel said gently, surprising her with his lack of bitterness. "He was deceived by his partner, just as the rest of us were, though he certainly profited enough from the fund's early success to soften whatever losses he personally suffered when it collapsed. I don't blame him entirely for what happened. I've learned over the years that blame rarely brings back what has already been lost." "How can you be so forgiving?" Samuel offered her a small, sad smile. "Because anger is a heavy thing to carry, Amelia, and I have carried enough heavy things in my life already. I would rather spend what time I have left finding small moments of peace than drowning myself in a resentment that changes nothing." Amelia looked at him with something that felt dangerously close to admiration, an emotion she had rarely allowed herself to feel toward anyone in her carefully controlled world. Here was a man who had lost everything, and yet somehow still found the strength to sit down at a piano and play something beautiful for a room full of strangers who had never once bothered to learn his name. She left the cottage that afternoon with her mind spinning, the full truth of Samuel's story settling heavily over everything she thought she understood about her own family, her own privilege, and the strange promise she had made in a moment of careless rebellion. That evening, as she made her way back toward the main house, she found Charles waiting for her near the garden entrance, his expression carrying none of its usual polished charm. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "About what?" "About the little performance you've been putting on with the staff," Charles said, crossing his arms. "Did you really think no one would notice you sneaking off to visit the janitor's cottage? People are talking, Amelia, and not in ways that reflect well on either of our families." Amelia felt her spine stiffen. "I don't answer to you, Charles." "You will, soon enough," he said, a cold smile creeping across his face that made her stomach twist uncomfortably. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer I share an interesting piece of information I recently discovered with the rest of society." A chill ran down Amelia's spine. "What information?" "It seems your talented pianist has quite the tragic history," Charles said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "A ruined career, a dead wife, a daughter he can barely afford to visit. Rather sad, really. I imagine the newspapers would find it fascinating, especially the part connecting his downfall directly to your father's old business dealings. Quite the scandal for a family already balancing on the edge of financial trouble, wouldn't you agree?" Amelia's blood ran cold. "How do you know about any of that?" "I have my ways," Charles said simply. "The point is, Amelia, I'm prepared to keep this unfortunate story buried, out of respect for our family's long history together, provided you agree to move forward with our engagement as originally planned. A proper announcement, a proper wedding, no further embarrassing displays involving the household staff." "You're threatening me." "I'm offering you a solution," Charles corrected smoothly. "One that protects everyone involved, including your beloved pianist and his precious daughter. I'd hate for something so painful to be dragged through every gossip column in the city." Amelia stared at him, disgust curling in her stomach at the casual cruelty behind his calm, polished tone. This was the man her father wanted her to marry. A man willing to weaponize another person's grief simply to secure his own pride and his family's business arrangement. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice tight. "You have until the end of the week," Charles said. "After that, I make no promises about my discretion." He walked away without another word, leaving Amelia standing alone in the darkening garden, her mind racing through every possible path forward, none of them offering an easy escape. She thought of Samuel's tired, forgiving eyes, of the daughter he hadn't seen in years, of the music that still lived somewhere deep inside him despite everything life had taken away. She thought of her father, standing frozen in his study at the mention of a name from his past, carrying a guilt he had clearly never fully reckoned with. And she thought of herself, standing on that staircase a week earlier, laughing carelessly as she made a promise she never expected anyone to actually answer. Whatever happened next, she understood now that there was no version of this story where she could simply return to the safe, predictable life she had been living before Samuel Hart sat down at that piano. Something had shifted permanently inside her, and she was no longer certain she wanted to find her way back to who she had been before. She only knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was not going to let Charles Whitman use Samuel's pain as a weapon, no matter what it cost her to stop him. That night, she returned to her father's study one final time, prepared to demand the full truth, no matter how much he wished to keep it buried. Her father was still awake when she knocked on his study door, exactly as she had expected. Edward Grant rarely slept before midnight, preferring instead to lose himself in ledgers and correspondence long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression must have warned him that this conversation would be different from their earlier one. "Sit down, Amelia," he said, setting aside the papers in front of him. She remained standing. "I know what happened to Samuel's family. I found the newspaper article, and he told me the rest. I know about the investment fund, about his wife, about everything your business dealings cost him." Her father's face went very still, the color draining slowly from his cheeks. For a long moment he said nothing at all, simply staring at her across the wide expanse of his desk, the silence stretching thin and brittle between them. "I did not know the fund was being mismanaged," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "You must believe that, Amelia. I trusted my partner completely. When the truth came out, I lost a great deal myself. But not everything," Amelia said. "You still had this house. You still had your name, your reputation, your ability to rebuild. Samuel lost his wife. He lost years with his daughter. He lost the only thing he ever loved doing, and he had to become invisible just to survive it." Her father flinched at her words, and for the first time in Amelia's entire life, she watched something crack behind his carefully composed exterior. He rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window, staring out at the darkened garden the way he so often did, when he wished to avoid looking directly at whatever difficult truth stood in front of him. "I have thought of him many times over the years," he admitted quietly. "I made inquiries once, shortly after everything collapsed, hoping to offer some manner of restitution, but he had already disappeared, and I told myself it was easier to let the past remain buried than to reopen wounds that could never truly be healed with money alone." "He's been working in this house for months," Amelia said. "Did you never recognize him?" "I avoid the staff quarters," her father admitted, shame evident in his voice. "It is easier to run a household when you do not look too closely at the people keeping it running. I did not recognize him until that night at the piano, and even then, I told myself I must have been mistaken, that surely fate would not be so cruel as to place him under this very roof." Amelia felt a fresh wave of anger rise in her chest, though it was tempered now by something closer to pity. Her father was not a monster. He was simply a man who had spent so many years building walls of comfort and denial around himself that he had lost the ability to see the human cost of his own success. "Charles knows," she said. "He's threatening to expose the story to the press unless I agree to marry him immediately, exactly as planned." Her father turned sharply from the window, alarm flashing across his face. "That would destroy this family's reputation beyond repair, especially with our financial position as precarious as it currently stands." "I don't care about the merger anymore," Amelia said firmly. "I care about what's right. Samuel has spent years being punished for a mistake he never made. I won't let Charles use his grief as a bargaining chip just to save face." "And what exactly do you propose we do instead?" her father asked, though his tone had lost its usual sharpness, replaced instead by something closer to genuine curiosity. Amelia hesitated, the beginnings of an idea forming in her mind, a still rough and uncertain but growing clearer with every passing second. "We tell the truth ourselves, before Charles has the chance to twist it into something ugly. We bring Samuel's story into the light on our own terms, and we make things right, as much as they can be made right after all these years." Her father studied her for a long moment, something unfamiliar shifting behind his eyes. Perhaps it was respect. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion from carrying a secret guilt for far too long. "You've changed, Amelia, since that night at the piano." "Maybe I finally woke up," she said simply. Over the following days, Amelia threw herself into a plan she barely dared to hope could actually succeed. She began by returning to Samuel's cottage each afternoon, gently coaxing him into conversations about music, about the concert halls he used to fill, about the daughter he missed with an ache that never seemed to fade. She learned that Lily was now 12 years old, bright and curious according to the letters her aunt occasionally sent, though Samuel had not held her in his arms since she was barely old enough to remember him clearly. "Would you play again?" Amelia asked him one afternoon, as they sat together on the small bench outside his cottage, watching the late afternoon sun stretch long shadows across the garden. "If you had the chance, truly perform again, in front of an audience who knew exactly who you were." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "I've thought about it, over the years, but every time I imagine sitting on that stage again, all I can think of is Clara, watching from the audience, the way she always did. I don't know if I could bear to play without her there." "Maybe you wouldn't be playing without her," Amelia said gently. "Maybe you'd be playing because of her, because everything you loved about music, she loved it too. Letting that part of yourself stay buried forever. Doesn't that feel like losing her all over again? Samuel looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between surprise and quiet gratitude. You speak like someone far older than your years, Amelia Grant. I've had a very educational few weeks, she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Amelia's father approached them both, something he had never done before, standing awkwardly at the edge of the garden path with his hands clasped behind his back. Samuel rose immediately, his posture stiffening into the careful formality of an employee addressing his employer. But Edward Grant surprised them both by extending his hand instead. Mr. Hart, he said, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding authority. I owe you an apology, long overdue. I cannot undo what happened all those years ago, but I would like the opportunity to try to make amends, if you're willing to allow it. Samuel stared at the offered hand for a long moment before finally accepting it, his grip firm despite the clear uncertainty in his eyes. That's a generous offer, Mr. Grant, though I confess I'm not entirely sure what amends would even look like after so many years. Perhaps we could start with something simple, Edward said. I understand you have a daughter you haven't seen in some time. I would like to help arrange a proper visit, at my expense, with no strings attached beyond the simple wish to see a family reunited. Amelia watched her father closely, searching for any sign of manipulation or hidden motive, but found only genuine sincerity in his expression, the same sincerity she had glimpsed briefly in his study days earlier. Whatever walls he had built around himself over the years, something about Samuel's quiet dignity seemed to be slowly chipping away at them. Samuel's eyes glistened, though he quickly blinked the emotion away, clearing his throat before responding. I would be deeply grateful for that, Mr. Grant, more than I can properly express. The reunion was arranged for the following weekend, and Amelia insisted on being present, eager to witness the moment Samuel had been quietly aching for across 3 long, difficult years. When Lily arrived at the estate, a bright, curious girl with her father's same dark hair and thoughtful eyes, the reunion unfolded exactly as tender and overwhelming as Amelia had hoped it might. Samuel knelt down and wrapped his daughter in an embrace so full of years of longing that even the household staff, gathered quietly nearby, found themselves wiping away unexpected tears. Lily, it turned out, had inherited far more from her father than his dark hair and thoughtful eyes. She had inherited his gift for music as well, though she had only ever practiced on a battered old upright piano at her aunt's modest home, never once having the chance to play something truly fine. That evening, in the quiet privacy of the ballroom, Samuel sat down at the grand piano once more, this time with his daughter perched beside him on the bench, and together they played a simple duet, their hands moving in careful, joyful synchronization across the keys. It was not the polished, professional performance of a concert hall. It was something better. It was a family, finally finding its way back to each other after years of separation, set to the gentle, imperfect music of 2 hearts remembering how to be happy again. Amelia watched from the doorway, her own eyes brimming with tears she made no effort to hide, and beside her, her father stood quietly as well, his expression unreadable, though something in his posture had softened considerably since the beginning of this strange, unexpected journey. But even as that tender moment unfolded, Amelia knew the peace of it would not last uninterrupted. Charles's deadline was fast approaching, and somewhere across the city, he was undoubtedly preparing to make good on his threat, eager to force her hand before she found a way to slip free of the engagement he considered his rightful claim. The following morning, a messenger arrived at the estate carrying an invitation that made Amelia's stomach twist with dread the moment she read it. Charles had arranged a grand engagement gala to be held at the largest concert hall in the city just 3 days later, publicly announcing their intention to marry in front of every prominent family in society. It was, Amelia understood immediately, both a proposal and a trap, designed to force her into a public commitment she could not easily escape without creating the very scandal Charles had been threatening all along. She sat with the invitation trembling slightly in her hands, aware that whatever happened next would determine far more than simply her own future. It would determine whether Samuel's long-buried story remained his own to tell, on his own terms, or whether it became nothing more than ammunition in Charles Whitman's carefully calculated game. She looked up to find her father watching her from across the breakfast table, his expression grave but resolute. "We'll go," he said quietly. "But not as Charles intends. If the truth is going to come out, Amelia, then let it come out the right way. Let it come out as an act of courage, not an act of blackmail." Amelia nodded slowly, a plan already beginning to take shape in her mind, one that would require every ounce of courage she possessed, and the help of a man who had spent years hiding from the very spotlight she was about to ask him to step back into. She only hoped Samuel would be willing to take that risk, for her, for his daughter, and for the music he had silenced within himself for far too long. The concert hall glittered that evening, its towering windows glowing gold against the darkening sky. Carriages lining the street for what felt like an endless stretch, each one carrying another face Amelia recognized from a lifetime of formal dinners and business functions. Charles had spared no expense in arranging the gala, determined to make his announcement the talk of the city for months to come, a public spectacle designed to leave Amelia no room to escape. She arrived with her father, both of them composed on the surface, though Amelia's heart pounded fiercely beneath the elegant blue gown she wore, aware that everything about to unfold rested on a plan that could just as easily collapse into disaster as succeed. Samuel had agreed to come as well, arriving quietly through a side entrance reserved for staff, though tonight, for the first time in years, he was not dressed in his gray uniform. Edward Grant had insisted on providing him with a proper suit, dark and finely tailored, and standing in it, Samuel looked every bit the celebrated musician he had once been, though his eyes still carried the same cautious uncertainty they always did. Lily remained back at the estate under Grace's careful watch, too young for the formality of the evening, though Samuel had promised her, with a tenderness that made Amelia's chest ache, that he would tell her everything the moment he returned. Inside the grand hall, the crowd buzzed with anticipation, champagne flowing freely as guests speculated about the nature of tonight's announcement. Charles found Amelia almost immediately, offering his arm with a triumphant smile that made her stomach turn. "You look radiant," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for those nearby to hear. "Ready to make this official? Ready for the truth to finally be told?" Amelia replied evenly, and something flickered uncertainly behind Charles's confident expression, though he quickly smoothed it away, clearly assuming she meant nothing more than the engagement he had spent the past week orchestrating. The evening proceeded exactly as such evenings always did, with speeches and toasts and careful diplomatic conversation, until finally the moment arrived that Charles had been building toward all night. He stepped onto the small stage at the front of the hall, tapping his glass for attention, the room slowly falling silent as every eye turned expectantly toward him. "Friends," Charles began, his voice carrying easily across the hushed crowd, "tonight, I have the honor of announcing my engagement to Miss Amelia Grant, uniting two of this city's finest families, in a partnership I believe will benefit us all for generations to come." Polite applause rippled through the room, though Amelia remained still beside her father, her expression carefully neutral despite the storm building inside her chest. Charles extended his hand toward her, inviting her up onto the stage to complete the performance he had so carefully choreographed. Amelia rose slowly, aware of every eye in the room following her movement, and walked toward the stage with a calm she did not entirely feel. But instead of taking Charles's outstretched hand, she stepped past him, turning instead to face the crowd directly. "Before anyone celebrates this announcement," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the silent hall, "there's something I think everyone deserves to hear first." Charles's smile faltered, uncertainty creeping into his expression for the first time that evening. "Amelia, perhaps this isn't the moment." "It's exactly the moment," she interrupted, turning to address the crowd once more. "Several weeks ago, at my family's engagement gathering, I made a foolish, careless promise. I said that whoever could play something on my mother's old piano that truly moved me, I would marry, instead of following the path already laid out for me. It was a joke, or at least I believed it was, until a man nobody in that room had ever bothered to truly see sat down and proved otherwise." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, curiosity replacing the earlier polite boredom on many faces. Charles shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly unsure how to regain control of a moment slipping rapidly from his grasp. "That man," Amelia continued, "was Samuel Hart, employed at my family's estate as a groundskeeper and janitor. What most of you don't know is that Samuel was once one of the most celebrated pianists in this entire country, a man whose career and family were destroyed by the collapse of an investment fund years ago, a collapse my own father was unknowingly connected to." The murmurs grew louder now, several heads turning to search the room, though Samuel remained quietly positioned near the back, half hidden by a pillar, exactly as he had been the night this entire story began. "I could have let that truth remain buried," Amelia continued, her eyes briefly finding Charles's increasingly pale expression. "In fact, someone in this very room attempted to use that truth as a weapon against me, threatening to expose Samuel's tragedy to the press unless I agreed to this engagement exactly as planned, on his terms, silencing anything that might embarrass him or his family." Gasps rippled through the crowd now, and Charles's composure crumbled entirely. his face flushing with a mixture of fury and panic as every eye in the room turned toward him with newfound suspicion. "That is a gross exaggeration," Charles said quickly, though his voice lacked its usual confident polish. "Is it?" Amelia asked calmly. "Because I have witnesses to our conversation in the garden, Charles, and I'm certain several members of this crowd would be very interested to learn exactly what kind of man they've been considering welcoming into their families through this proposed marriage." Charles opened his mouth to protest further, but the damage had already spread visibly through the room, whispered conversations breaking out in every direction, disapproving glances aimed increasingly in his direction rather than Amelia's. Whatever plan he had carefully constructed for this evening had collapsed entirely, undone by his own cruelty finally being dragged into the light. Amelia turned away from him then, addressing the crowd once more, her voice softening slightly. "I did make a promise that night, and I intend to honor it, though not in the way anyone in this room might have expected." She turned toward the back of the hall. "Samuel, would you do me the honor?" A hush fell over the room as Samuel stepped out from behind the pillar, making his way slowly toward the stage. Whispers followed him the entire way, disbelief evident on many faces as they recognized, some for the first time, the name and reputation that had once made him a celebrated figure in exactly these kinds of grand halls. He reached the stage and paused, glancing toward Amelia with a question in his eyes, uncertain exactly what she intended. She simply gestured toward the beautiful grand piano positioned near the center of the stage, the very kind of instrument he had once filled with music in concert halls just like this one. "Play something for me," she said softly, echoing the words that had started this entire journey. "Not because of a foolish promise this time, but because I would very much like to hear you play again, and I believe, somewhere out there tonight, someone else who loves you very much would like to hear it too." Samuel's eyes glistened, understanding immediately who she meant, though Lily remained back at the estate. He looked out across the crowd, hundreds of faces watching him with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and slowly dawning recognition, and for a moment, Amelia worried he might simply turn and walk away, unable to face the very world that had once cast him aside so completely. Instead, he walked to the piano and sat down. The hall fell utterly silent as his fingers found the keys once more, and this time, there was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty in his posture. He played with the full confidence of a man reclaiming something that had always belonged to him, something no collapsed investment fund, no personal tragedy, and no cruel manipulation had ever truly managed to take away. The melody that filled the hall was different from the one he had played weeks earlier in the Grant Ballroom, brighter now, filled with a hopeful energy that spoke of reunions and second chances, rather than simply loss and endurance. Amelia watched from beside the piano, tears slipping freely down her cheeks, unashamed of the emotion on display in front of hundreds of society's most prominent families. Beside the stage, her father stood with his own eyes glistening, watching the man he had once wronged reclaim his rightful place in front of the very kind of audience that had once celebrated him, and would soon come to celebrate him again. When the final notes faded into silence, the applause that followed was thunderous, genuine, and completely unlike the polite, uncertain clapping from weeks earlier. Several guests rose to their feet, and among the crowd, Amelia noticed more than one face belonging to a concert hall director or music patron she recognized from her father's business circles, all of them watching Samuel with expressions of stunned admiration. Charles had quietly slipped from the hall sometime during the performance, his grand engagement announcement thoroughly overshadowed and his reputation, at least among this particular crowd, considerably tarnished by the truth Amelia had chosen to reveal on her own terms, rather than allowing him to control the narrative any further. In the weeks that followed, word of Samuel's story and his remarkable return to the piano spread quickly through the city's musical circles. Concert hall directors reached out with cautious inquiries, curious whether the once celebrated pianist might consider returning to the stage in some capacity. Samuel approached these opportunities carefully at first, still healing from years of self-imposed exile from the world of music. But with Amelia's steady encouragement, and Lily now living happily at the estate under her father's generous arrangement, he slowly began accepting smaller performances, rebuilding a career and a life he had once believed permanently lost. Edward Grant, for his part, quietly established a fund of his own, one dedicated to supporting musicians and their families who had been financially devastated through no fault of their own, a private act of restitution that he never once sought public credit for, though Amelia knew exactly what it meant, and exactly how much it cost her father to finally confront the guilt he had buried for so many years. As for Amelia and Samuel, their relationship deepened slowly and naturally over the following months, built not on the foolish promise made in a moment of careless rebellion, but on something far sturdier, forged through shared vulnerability, mutual respect, and the quiet recognition of two people who had each, in their own way, been trapped by circumstances beyond their control, and had found in each other an unexpected path toward freedom. On a bright afternoon, nearly a year after that first fateful evening, the Grant ballroom filled once more with guests, though this time, the atmosphere carried none of the tension or performance of that earlier gathering. Amelia stood at the top of the same marble staircase where she had once made a careless joke that changed the course of her entire life, dressed not for a business gala, but for her wedding. Samuel waited for her beside the grand piano, Lily standing proudly at his side as she prepared to play a small piece she had been practicing for months, specifically for this occasion. Edward Grant stood nearby as well, his expression carrying a quiet pride and relief that Amelia had rarely seen from him throughout her entire childhood. A man finally at peace with a past he could not change, but had done everything within his power to make right. As Amelia descended the staircase, the room fell quiet in a way that mirrored that very first evening. Though this silence carried none of the earlier mockery or disbelief, it was filled instead with genuine warmth, with the anticipation of witnessing something truly earned rather than simply expected. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, Samuel took her hands in his eyes filled with an emotion that needed no further words to explain. Lily began to play, her small fingers moving carefully across the keys of the piano her father had taught her to love. The melody simple but beautiful, a song written specifically for this day, by the man who had once believed his music had been lost to him forever. Amelia looked around the room, at her father's proud, emotional expression, at Grace beaming from among the gathered guests, at Lily's careful, joyful concentration as she played for her father's wedding, and finally back at Samuel, the quiet janitor who had once been dismissed and overlooked by an entire ballroom of guests, now standing before her as the man she had chosen with her whole heart, not because of any careless promise, but because of everything real and true she had discovered in the months since that promise was first spoken. The wedding that followed was modest by the standards of the Grant family's usual grand affairs, exactly as Amelia had requested, filled with genuine laughter and unforced joy, rather than the careful, calculated performances that usually accompanied society weddings. And when the ceremony concluded, Samuel led his new wife to the piano bench, sitting down beside her exactly as he had once sat down beside his daughter, and together, imperfectly, joyfully, they played the final song of the celebration, a duet built from months of quiet lessons Amelia had insisted on taking, determined to share this piece of Samuel's world exactly as fully as he had shared it with her. Outside the tall windows of the ballroom, evening settled gently over the estate gardens, the same gardens where Samuel had once worked quietly and invisibly, tending hedges and repairing gates while carrying a grief nobody around him ever thought to ask about. Now, laughter and music spilled from those same windows into the cooling evening air, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of a family finally made whole again, built not from careless promises or convenient business arrangements, but from courage, honesty, and the simple, unexpected magic of a piano that had waited patiently for years to be played by the right hands once more.